And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Keith Kuntz, and we are coming to you live from Co-op High School here in New Haven for a special town hall presentation from News 8 and the New Haven Independent after Sandy Hook in search of answers. We will be dealing with some very difficult subjects over the next hour, and we're going to be commercial-free for the entire hour. We're talking about gun violence, gun control, school safety issues, and it's an honor to be joined by a very distinguished panel of guests who are going to be weighing in on that subject. I want to start with Dr. Stephen Behrens, who comes to us from the Yale Child Study Center. We're happy to have him. Tracy Suggs, whose son was sadly killed in an act of urban violence in New Haven. Richard Klett is the Newtown Schools Director of Security. Yesenia Perez joins us from New Haven, where she is an elementary school teacher. State Senator Joe Markley, a Republican from Southington. Our police chief here in New Haven, Dean Esserman. Social worker on a state level, Susan McKinley. We are also thrilled to have a number of young people with us as well this afternoon. They include Michaela Duran Crinlin, who is a junior at Guilford High School, Emmy Rode, who is a freshman at Amity High School, and Kenya Amaker, who is a senior at Hill House High School. And I'm also joined by Paul Bass. I'm sure I mentioned Paul, but he is the editor of the New Haven Independent, and he will be joining me in the questioning. We also have live bloggers who are with us this afternoon, and among those live bloggers, we have New Haven Mayor John DeStefano Jr., and of course we have a live audience, and we will field as many questions on as wide a range of topics as we can possibly do over the next hour. Chief Esserman, let me start with you. In a free and open society like we have, with so many weapons already out there in circulation, can any piece of legislation really prevent the occasional act of madness that we've seen repeated over and over again in the society in recent years?
Thank you. I think legislation can make a difference. I think it speaks to the conscience of the community, and that in and of itself is important.
You know, Joe Markley, you're a state senator, and you've been up there in Hartford, and that's all anyone's talking about these days, right? You're not talking about taxes these days. You're not talking about other issues facing the state. You're talking about what happened in Newtown and what can make us safer. Should we have more legislation on guns? Should we be looking at our mental health system improving? Do you feel, Joe, while you're sitting there day and night at the Capitol, that there's a possibility there's anything you can do that's going to make people safer in Connecticut?
I think that the problems go beyond the ability of the legislature to entirely cure. I hope we might begin to move things in the right direction. I'm specifically involved with the mental health task force. We had hearings last night until 11 o'clock, a fascinating day. The thing about it is that there's problems with the delivery systems that we have perhaps 2 weeks to put a report together and suggestions. The most I can hope out of that is that we make one good step, perhaps.
Well, what is the key problem with that delivery system, and how do we fix it?
Well, I think that part of the problem goes back to the deinstitutionalization in the 70s. Perhaps not the fact of deinstitutionalization, but that we didn't prepare the services that were needed to take care of people. And the services that are provided are often in a rather fragmented way. It's very hard to figure out where to go, what you're entitled to, or who serves what. And just untangling that part of the system, I think, would be a service.
I want to move on to Dr. Behrens, and I want to stay on this mental health care aspect of this. Is there any way of predicting the mental state of a person who's likely to cause the kind of madness that we've seen around the nation?
That's a tough question, Keith. I think what we know, number one, is that there is the horror that we've all experienced, and especially the town of Newtown, but have been visited, as you mentioned, around the country too often over the last years, is an opportunity to allow all of us to step back and think, as the chief suggested, what kind of society do we want to live in? And I think that there is a wish in the face of our horror to come up with quick solutions and quick answers. The short answer to your question is that there are lots of obstacles, not just in terms of the issues of care that's available, and there are many obstacles there, but there are also obstacles in terms of successful, horrible acts that occurred in Newtown and elsewhere that we haven't yet come up with the answers that are simple in terms of detecting who is likely to perpetrate those and who isn't.
But now, Stephen, you work with the U.S. Attorney General on a task force about children and violence. And you were studying this before the Newtown massacre. Did you guys come up with anything that you actually believe can be done? Do we already know some steps we can take to prevent this kind of incidents?
Absolutely, and I think that for understandable reasons, the emotions that are stirred up when violence occurs are so enormous that we have a tendency to think in one dimension. We even talk about violence as if it's one type of behavior. So that part of what the Attorney General's task force did over the last year, conducting hearings around the country, was to hear from communities about the different kinds of violence that are affecting our communities across the nation, and to actually think about the things that we know can be effective in intervening.
And can you think off the top of your head some things we should be doing in Connecticut that we're not doing?
Well, I think that Connecticut has actually been one of the leaders in developing some of the responses, but they've not been generalized. So, for example, we know some of the risk factors and predictors for greater likelihood of people becoming violent in later life, not necessarily of the kind of mass murder that we see and has been so disturbing over this last month and at other times, but the kind of violence that kids and older people have been involved in on a day-to-day basis. We know, for example, that exposure to domestic violence, exposure to community violence, that when kids go unrecognized, unidentified, when they don't have the supports that are needed to recover from the trauma that this violence exposure leads to, they're at greater likelihood of school problems, anxiety and depression, of failing in relationships.
So I know in New Haven you've been sending child psychologists out with the police. So you're talking about a kid who sees their parent, God forbid, getting shot or stabbed, that you need to work with them now so they don't create problems later. Is that something you want Joe Markley to be looking at over the next 2 weeks? Is that something we need to be doing throughout Connecticut, to send social workers or psychologists with the police to help these kids?
I agree with State Senator Markley that to come up with one response as a beginning is a good step. And the question is, can we continue the discussion and take advantage of what we've learned? We know that early intervention for kids who are exposed to violence in their homes and communities on a daily basis has a much greater likelihood of preventing post-traumatic stress disorder and other associated disorders that can contribute to a range of failures in life, including later perpetration of violence. We know that when longer-term treatments that have been proven effective in treating those kids and adolescents who have suffered from their exposure, traumatic exposure to violence, that they can get better. But our communities need to have access to the resources and the knowledge that's out there, and they need to have access to the kinds of collaborations that were developed in New Haven and elsewhere, for example, between law enforcement and mental health and child protective services, that have proven so effective in attacking the first issue, which is, can we identify the kids and families that need our help?
Doctor, thank you. I want to turn the attention to some of our young people now and ask you how your life has changed, the way you approach school, perhaps, in the wake of what we saw happen in Newtown. Any of you young ladies? I think it's already on.
Oh, it's on. That's great. First step, embarrass yourself. As far as my life changing, do you, at school,
the way you approach school security, do you think more about security when you're at school? Are you more aware of entrances, exits? Is there a guard there? Do we need a guard there on that level?
Not really, and I'm glad for that, because I feel that to live in fear after this incident would not be preferable at all. And I think instead of thinking more about security in school, I'm thinking about security globally, and I'm thinking about everything that's been going on in the media, as well as in discussion in my own home about gun control, mental illness, our own culture, which is at stake.
Well, Kenyatta, you go to school at Hill House in New Haven. Did you feel differently? Do you feel less safe or more safe after something like Newtown happens? Did you already feel safe in school?
I already felt safe in school, one, because we already have cops in our school and security guards as all around. So I always felt comfortable in my school because we always had someone there to protect us. So after Newtown accident, I just thought of it as, oh, we're already protected. So if anything was to happen, that we would be okay and that Mr. Carolina will be able to make sure that everything goes
That's
well.
the principle. I wonder what you think about that, Rich Klett, because you're in Newington and you're in charge of making sure schools are safe. That's your job. But you also responded years ago when there was a massacre at the lottery headquarters when you were the police chief for Newington. Is she right that having cops with guns are going to do the trick? As long as you have some cops with guns roaming the halls in schools, people will be safe. That's what the NRA is telling us.
Well, I think the NRA is saying more than just cops in schools. I think what they're aiming for is guns in school. And but as far as the cops in school, basically they're school resource officers for the most part, and their job really is to provide assistance to the administration, dealing with bullying, dealing with mediation, dealing with arbitrations, dealing with the social and psychological issues that occur in school. And occasionally, they have to react to situations that would require a law enforcement officer. And so I think to characterize a policeman in school for the sole purpose of enforcing laws is a misnomer. He's really there to help on a day-to-day basis, identify certain kids and students in schools who may be problematic, so we can do some work and try to resolve those situations.
Would you advocate an officer at every school? Is that where we ought to go?
That's a very significant financial decision. That's a community decision to say that. I think that basically you can certainly justify SRO or SROs in a high school and probably a middle school.
You mean a cop, right? A
School resource officer is a sworn law enforcement officer assigned there from the police department. When he's not in school, he would be on patrol.
But when you think about the Newtown schools and you say we don't want to have another Newtown happen there, are you thinking, Rich, day to day, I need more people in there with guns? Or what are you thinking to make sure it doesn't happen to your town?
Well, there's a lot of steps that can be taken to, you can't necessarily prevent someone from entering a school. Prisons are made today for the express purpose of keeping people in and people escape. And now you're asking us, okay, basically to have a school, a public school, and keep people out. It's if you harden up one area of a school, you basically have soft areas. All schools that have had incidents, basically, they all have been premeditated. So they're going to design their way to get into a school the easiest way. Now, for the most part, let me just say one other thing is, for the most part, okay, and with the exception of Newtown and maybe a few others, the perpetrators that have conducted these things are students who are authorized to be in the school to begin with. It's a rare instance to have a school shooting occur, and it's a rare instance to have it from an external threat.
So what can you do? When you look at these kids back here and you want them to feel safe going to high school, what do you think you can do to make sure they are safe?
Well, there's lots of things that I think have been put in place since Columbine back in 1998 or 1999. Control your entrances. You have access control, strong visitor policies. And in Newington, we identify the different classifications of people in our building by use of lanyards, video surveillance. And the video surveillance is just not to see what the kids are doing, but we also use video in conjunction with the police, basically. So if an incident does happen, they have that much more knowledge even before they get to the building to see what's going on. In fact, I could demonstrate to you right now that I can bring up live cameras at my schools on my iPad and on my iPhone.
You could do that right now sitting here.
So you can check now to see if someone's roaming your halls there.
Right. So
But is that enough, or do you have to make sure people are actually watching those cameras?
We don't have cameras to sit there and place somebody to monitor, and that becomes a personnel issue. I mean, and like, for example, at our high school, which is a population of 1,500 students, we have 64 cameras. And I would venture a guess that monitoring 64 cameras over an 8-hour period, the person is going to miss something. And what happens is if you increase the expectation, you increase the liability. We're more reactive to what goes on in the video than we are trying to
Well,
watch
Emmy,
everything.
you're at Amity Regional High School. You're listening to Richard Klett talk about how they keep the school safe. When you hear that, does that make you feel safe about where you're going to school?
I definitely think that the administration at my school has done the best job to ensure our safety, and for the kids that are doubtful of the system that we already had in place, they tried to increase the security guards and the cameras, and I think all the teachers and the people watching have tried to stop any student and say, you know, if you're afraid of what has just happened and you don't feel safe in our school, then come talk to us and tell us how we can improve or how we can ensure that you feel safe.
Well, so Ksenia, you're every day dealing with second graders, I believe, correct? You're a bilingual teacher at Clinton Avenue School in New Haven. When Newtown happened, what was your reaction? Did you feel that you're safe with those kids? What was going through your mind?
I was very nervous at first, but I know that at Clinton Avenue School we do have our Code Red policies, and the students are aware. We have practiced them several times, so I know that in case of an emergency that we will be safe. After the incident, administration also went over with us the Code Red in different areas of the school so that the students and the teachers and any other staff felt safe. So
I want to get to the issue of background checks for gun purchases. I know that's a little off what we've been talking about specifically now, but I wanted to raise it. Do all of us here agree on universal background checks, even at gun shows, or are there people who don't agree with that for gun buyers? Anybody on the panel would not agree with that?
I think it's a good idea for everybody, and I think that's one of the things that's more likely to come out of the legislative proposals. Also, background checks in cases of private purchase from person to person. It's a small extension of what's already in place, and the system is there to do it.
Okay, so that's one thing that legislatively might change. Can you foresee, either at a state level or a federal level, anything else being changed from a policy point of view as a result of what we've seen in Connecticut 6 weeks ago?
I think there's a possibility of changes. I think there's certainly a lot of pressure for the magazine capacity. I have to say, frankly, I'm not convinced that it would have any impact on this kind of incident. But incident, an adequate word for it.
Chief Esserman, do you as a police chief feel that it would help you at all keep New Haven safe if we limited the number of bullets someone could shoot in 20 seconds with those magazines?
I do, respectfully. You know, I'm a supporter of the military. I believe in the military, and I believe they should have the right equipment, but it's for the military. They're not designed, they were never thought of for the citizens of our cities or our communities. So I think part of military weapons is to use in a field of fire and to shoot as many bullets as you can. They do that very effectively.
But
they should be with the military.
But some would counter that the Second Amendment gives a person in this country the right to have an arm. So isn't it a Second Amendment right, Chief?
I'm a lawyer. I'm a student of the Constitution. I think many of us have different views of the Second Amendment. But I think we all agree that when we live in a community together, rights come with responsibilities.
Well, what about that Second Amendment, Joe Markley? Do you think that the Second Amendment gives me a right to have an assault weapon and be a commando and shoot someone up in 20 seconds, a whole classroom?
Certainly doesn't give you the right to break a law, and I think that's where the line is drawn. It says that both the federal and the state constitution are very explicit about the right to bear arms, and I think that that words like assault weapons, I feel like every gun is an assault weapon. every gun is a deadly weapon. There's no such thing as a gun that exists only for defensive purpose, or a gun that only shoots targets or it only can be used for hunting. And I think that we have an assault weapons ban already in Connecticut.
Although they don't count some of these assault rifles that are even called AR-15 for assault rifle, but because of all the loopholes, they're not actually assault rifles.
I didn't know that you'd call it a loophole. It's because what defines the guns have to be described in the law. There's not a quality of the gun that you could say this makes it an assault weapon and that one isn't. So they talk about things like what kind of stock does it have and flash suppressors and so forth. They're all essentially cosmetic features of the guns. And I think that, again, if someone takes a position of saying, we want to get guns out of society 100%, I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's constitutional, but at least it has a certain logic behind it. But we're making other ones I don't think would have an impact.
Okay, I want to bring Tracy Suggs into the conversation. Sadly, you lost your son, just 16 years old, to an act of urban violence. There's been so much press put on the gun control, gun violence issue in the wake of some of these mass shootings that we've had. Do you think young people killed in urban violence every year, and the issue is now becoming a real front burner issue? Do you question the timing?
Actually, I do question the timing. And at the time, my son was 13 years old when his life was taken. May my heart and my prayers and strength go out to the families of Newtown, but this should have been a long time coming.
Well, that's a question a lot of people have brought up. I'd be interested in what you have to say, Tracy, what other people say. All of a sudden, the whole state has stopped talking about anything else but how to prevent gun violence. Your son was riding his bike home from a carnival when people he didn't know were shooting each other and the bullet hit him and he died. When you're saying, why weren't we talking about this before, do you think it's the same issue? When you think about what happened in Newtown, is that like what happened to your son?
I would say yes, it is like what happened to my son. I mean, this issue's been out here for years, and it's sad, again, I say that it took Newtown to bring it to life with the nation, our government, and all the surrounding communities. But this is something that has been spoken on and spoken on. And it does bother me that it took this to happen to these babies for somebody to actually want to stand up and hear what we've been saying all along. Gun violence is an illness, and it needs to be cured.
Well, we're looking at the questions here about, Keith was saying and Joe was saying, will it have any impact if we put more of these rules on guns, if we say you can't fire as many bullets as fast, or we're going to better define assault rifles? As a mother who lost a child, do you feel that that could have saved his life, or that there's something specific that can be done to save other children's lives that way?
It may make an impact. I'm not going to say it's going to make a big impact, but at the same time, we have to think about it. Like it was said earlier, the guns are out there already. So how do we keep track of who's actually owning up to their guns, knowing that the guns are in the homes, and how do you really track?
That's interesting you say that, because there's a proposal right now in the legislature that hasn't gotten much discussion that would say that Chief Esserman and Rich Klett should know who in the community has a gun, especially if they've been convicted of a crime, but that we don't have to know. It's called a gun registry that they want to start. It's like a sexual registry for someone who's been a predator, comes in a community. And under this proposal, unlike with the sexual offender registry, they don't want neighbors to be able to know who has the gun, but they do want the police chief to know who has a gun. And Joe Markley, is that something that you think can pass a bipartisan consensus up there in Hartford?
Well, we already have it for handguns, certainly, which are registered in Connecticut. I think that the only question would be whether that be extended to long guns, which haven't been in the past.
But an offender registry, people who've had other committed crimes that have a gun, they want the police chiefs to know who they are so their police can keep track of people who might commit the next crime.
You have felons are prohibited from having them as it stands. I suppose that the ability to find out who has a gun and who has committed a crime is already available, in the sense that it's merely a matter of matching records against each other. I don't know that again, Paul, I'm not sure that would have any impact on it, to say we've located a certain number of people that have committed misdemeanors and also have handguns.
Well, there was a paper recently in Westchester County, New York, that and you're shaking your head, you know what I'm going to say, that very controversially, in a lot of people's opinions, published the addresses and names of people who are gun owners in that community. And they later took that information down. There was a lot of controversy about it. Do you think that is a bad idea? That
Yes,
it should be...
I think it's knowledge to the, it's something that's known already to law enforcement. I don't see how making that public is helpful, and I don't know to anybody. And I think it's a way to try to stigmatize people who are otherwise living completely within the law.
Do you think gun owners just in general are getting a bad rap these days? That the vast majority of gun owners who are responsible and have a weapon for protection, might want to do some hunting or some shooting, that they're being lumped in with a bad crowd?
You know, Keith, I'd say this. I think that there are people that pursue that interest. It's not one that I've ever had particularly, that shoot for whatever reason, whether it's hunting or targets or skeet or whatever they shoot. And if you're in that world, which is more common in other parts of the country, it's the most natural thing going. If you're not, one looks at it and says, why would anyone want to do that? But I think that part of the sense in America is that people pursue their own interests and their own pursuit of happiness.
In this part of the country, father and son might go out, toss football around. In other parts of the country, a father might be taking his young son out to shoot.
Yes.
And that's a culture that a lot of people don't understand in this part of the world, correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. I think it's easier to perhaps to demonize them or to question their motives because of that.
Do you think that a hobby takes priority over whether lives are at risk or not?
I think that pursuing that, again, I'd say if a magic wand could be waved and things eliminated from the world, there's lots of things I'd get rid of. I'd say alcohol, for instance, is an example of something that a lot of people enjoy, but on balance is probably a destructive thing in the world. We've made that attempt to get rid of it, and we're not able to.
Well, would you like roadblocks then? With alcohol, we have the police setting up roadblocks to try to catch the drunk drivers before they kill someone. Should we be taking more proactive steps to stop the crazy gun holders?
Your metaphors are getting too strained for me necessarily to respond to, Paul. But again, I think in both cases you say, yes, you don't want people to use anything in a way that's harmful to others, but you can't prohibit them from having the thing at all just because the possibility of harm exists.
Susan McKinley, as a social worker, speak to us about the long-term damage that a horrific act like we saw at Sandy Hook has on the other children at that school, in that community, the parents, and the difficulties they have moving forward in their lives.
I am an expert in the area of working with adults, so I really can't speak to what the children and the families must be going through. Their lives are probably changed forever. What we can hope, though, is that this spurs a discussion, much like Mrs. Suggs said, that is long overdue about fixing our mental health system. Making cuts to our mental health system should not happen. We've been chiseling away at our mental health system for years. We closed 2 large institutions with the promise that we would convert some of that money into community-based services. Some of that happened, and then we chiseled away at that. We certainly don't do enough with regard to early identification and early intervention. Again, those of you who are the educators can tell me about how many social workers and school psychologists we have in our system. I'm guessing we don't have enough. So on that side, we're certainly not doing what we need to do, which only compounds the problem because then problems worsen and then people bring them into adulthood.
I know you deal with adults, but this is still your area. Can you spot in a young person, a child, the signs of somebody who might have a problem down the line? Are there consistent patterns of behavior in a young person that we see in a lot of these cases?
The same way that we look at illnesses and conditions in adults is the same way that we can identify and diagnose children, so that educators, family members, social workers, people in the community who know the children best, they notice when there are changes. They notice when there has been something significant that is affecting that youngster.
Well, Susan, what do you look for with adults? Don't you have to make some of these decisions now in your current job? You go to court to say whether some adult who has a mental illness is at risk of causing harm to himself or to others. Can we really be certain enough? How do you tell if somebody's going to be causing trouble that way?
Well, as the doctor indicated, the ability to gauge risk is limited. Unless a person is actually telling us everything that they're thinking, then we are trying our best to evaluate the extent to which they've been violent in the past, whether or not they have some condition that is contributing to their thinking about violence towards others. Mostly we're trying to evaluate whether or not a person is capable of living out in the community and taking care of themselves. That's also a factor with regard to whether or not they're released from the hospital.
Well, Steve, go ahead and jump in.
I couldn't agree with Susan more about the incredible cuts, and so I wanted to just make two comments. I do have a concern, and this is an example of the lumping that gets done. There's been a lot of talk about guns and mental illness. The likelihood of people who are considered mentally ill, which typically refers to folks with serious psychiatric diagnoses, the likelihood of them becoming violent is as low as saying that someone who has brown hair is going to become violent in the way that we saw a month ago.
So you're saying you're looking for a needle in a haystack, even under the best circumstances?
I think what I'm saying, Keith, is that when we get very upset, because this kind of event touches all of us, especially those who know loss at the hands of violence the best, and that we search for a needle in a haystack as a way of finding a balm for the kind of dangers and upset that we all share as human beings. So I wanted to go back to something that Ms. Suggs was saying a moment ago. You know well, Tracy, that the voices have been there, but they've never been loud enough. And if we take an opportunity out of the horrors of what happened last month as a way of honoring those that were lost and those lost well before, then we actually have a chance to step back and join in one voice and say, enough silence, enough inaction. But when we do that, I hope that rather than looking for the needle in the haystack, we're going to think comprehensively about the different kinds of causes of perpetration of violence.
As I look back on my lifetime, and I'm in my early 50s, I don't recall a number of cases of these mass killings during my youth. I'm sure there were cases, but in just the past few years, we've seen, obviously, Sandy Hook, we've seen Columbine, Aurora, Colorado, the Wisconsin shooting, the mall shooting out in Portland. We're seeing a lot of them now. Is there any way of explaining why it seems like we're seeing so many more of these type of incidents in this time in the culture?
Anyone have a thought on that, Susan?
Well, I haven't studied the issue, right? And I do know.
I mean, is my premise even right? I mean,
I'm wondering about the extent to which we're capable of sharing information very rapidly at a moment's notice, right? That certainly has an impact. So
what about these violent video games? And I'm not familiar with them. I've read about them. I've seen them. I've never participated. But these machines where you can be the first person shooter and you're actually taking people out, does that, do you think, contribute also to this culture we're in?
The same way that I would say that there's not one single thing that is going to cause a person to be violent and violent in a massive way, it certainly is unfair to say that video games cause everyone to be violent. In the situations where people are committing these horrific crimes, it is likely that there are numerous factors that are contributing. And of course, when we look back at these situations and we kind of dissect it in hindsight, well, then we realize there were a number of factors that people can point
Well, I
to.
guess Keith is asking about cause or effect. I mean, Steve, it's just that someone who's violent is drawn to a video game, or is a video game given the idea to blow people up?
I think Susan's comment is exactly right. So that's part of my answer. But the other part is that we're not thinking enough about what isn't happening in kids' lives. The kids who are parking themselves in front of violent video games for hours on end, the question is, where are the other opportunities for them to develop in other areas of life? Where are the opportunities to be enriched, to have time with family, to have supports in the community, etc.? And if we're going to talk about the impact of violence in the media, and I don't know that there have been any studies done on this, but I think there is some real concern about the way that media covers the violence that occurs, especially at their most horrific.
How so specifically?
I think that there is a level of, at times, not by all outlets of the media, but there is at times sensationalist approaches whose aim is to grab audiences, that arouses people, that inflames feelings of fear that are not based in the reality of circumstances. There are ways in which there is a kind of notoriety and attention that is created by these events, and I'm not suggesting that there should not be news, but the way that the news is approached, I think, is another part of the discussion we need to be having.
Well, how did you feel about, I'm wondering about Kenyatta and Michaela and Emmy. Do you feel that your friends are on video games too often, that the games are too violent, or that, as Dr. Marin says, the TV's on too much in people's homes with 24/7 wall-to-wall coverage of stuff to be scared about?
Well, I believe that it all starts with attention. Like, they're not getting enough attention at home, or they leave school and then it's just where I go. I'm going home and then I'm in my room and I'm not doing anything. My mom's at work, my dad's at work, so what is there for me to do? So I'm playing a game, I'm watching a movie, and it's nothing but violence around. It just seemed like so much fun there, so what else is there for me to do? Okay, let me make it real. And I'm going to go outside and I'm going to go shoot at the bird in the tree, or I'm going to go do something else just to enjoy myself, or just to relieve anger because they have no one to speak to. So it's just basically off of attention.
Chief Esserman, I want to ask you about gun buybacks. I know New Haven has had successful gun buybacks. Bridgeport recently has had some very successful gun buybacks. Is this a real way to go to getting a significant number of weapons off the street, and would you like to see this continued and even more of it as we move forward?
Yes. This is a police chief that will get all the help he can get, take all the help he can get, and taking any gun off the street, to me, is a good decision. But I want to make sure I follow up on the words of this poor mother who lost a child of New Haven. Assault weapons are not killing the children of New Haven. Didn't kill any of them this year, didn't kill any of them last year. What happened in Newtown was horrific. It can't capture the attention and make us blind to what is causing death every day on the streets of cities and towns of America. It is time, and perhaps the event will be the catalyst, but it's time for all of us who love this country to have the moral outrage to say that we are losing our children. These are our children. The face of violence in America is the face of young men. On both sides of the weapon, and almost always, the instrument of death is a gun. And almost always, all three are made in America. Immigration has nothing to do with this conversation for serious people. And almost always they know one another. The face of violence in our communities is young men who kill young men who know one another. Sometimes there are these horrible massacres with these military weapons. But always, there are shootings on streets and across the country. We have cut the violence in this city significantly in the past year. But that means nothing to any mother that I've had to visit, because behind these statistics are stories. And these stories are all the same. They are a generation that we are losing. And if it takes Newtown to be a catalyst, then so be it. If it takes gun buyback programs to take back a gun, so be it. But I think this country needs to come together and say, these are our children.
Mm-hmm.
These are all our children that we are losing.
Chief, given what you've said, and given the focus that now is on gun control, gun violence, if something cannot be done right now, a lot of people consider where we are now a tipping point in the discussion. What hope do you have for the future?
I have a lot of hope. I love my country. I have a lot of hope for it. But I heard in this room something that I think is a good caution, which is that sometimes a rush to the fast answer is not the right answer. We need to think this through. We need to keep this conversation going. I think we need to take time.
Senior, how are you feeling hope-wise? You're with second graders. Now, Clinton Avenue School, many of them come from families that are new to the country, kind of hopeful people and their parents for a better life. Are you concerned about the culture your second graders are growing up in when you think about Newtown and the violence in the streets? How do you think about it as a teacher dealing with them day to day?
I just think that it's so important to ensure my students that they're coming to school to a safe environment. They see the security guards. We have the New Haven Police Department who came in the beginning of the year and walked through the building so the students know who they are. They know they're around their neighborhood to keep them safe, just in case there was anything happening in their community. They know that they can go to them. They know they can come to the teachers, the administration. So I feel that plans are in place. The kids know that we're talking to them and that they're safe and that we continue forward and we improve on what we need to.
Have you noticed any difference in the way your children have acted over the past 6 weeks?
No.
Are they aware?
We haven't had that discussion in the classroom. If they brought it up, I just told them that's something that you can discuss at home with your parents if you have any questions. And just know that here at Clinton Avenue, you are safe and that the administration and everyone in the building just wants them to come to school and learn, and that we will do all that we can for them.
At what age is it too young to talk to a child, a son, or a daughter about what has happened in Newtown?
Steve, you've been putting out some advice on that subject.
I think that part of what my friend was mentioning earlier about attention and listening is true every day, but especially true when the times are tough and when there are tough things to talk about. And so we need to listen to our kids and to hear what their concerns are, and to also to be watching the different ways in which particularly younger children tell us that they're concerned, because it's often not in words, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing is in terms of recovery in Newtown, this is a strong community. These are strong families, a strong set of leaders, and we know from other situations that kids and adults can recover. Sometimes this search for the quick answer is driven by our feelings of helplessness. And when we're feeling helpless, we cower and we get quiet. I think sometimes we aren't even able to see the successes and to see the models of strength and moving forward. And this town, New Haven, and this kind of community policing in New Haven is a wonderful example of success that has more work to do, more community support needed. But too often, we're only hearing about what makes us afraid rather than the opportunities to stand together behind the people who are working in our community, for our community, with our community, to help us find a new way and to find strength in numbers.
Well, Rich Klett, how did Newington recover after that shooting? How did the community come to grips with what happened there?
Well, the lottery obviously was a tragic situation. If anything, the lottery told us was if it can happen in Newington, basically it can happen anywhere. And as you see these things develop, that's true. That was workplace violence. We had town residents who actually worked there, and some that never actually returned to work at the lottery, even after they moved. But somehow you start the next day and you try to put yourself back together. Some can and some won't. I mean, as far as the community was overwhelmed, but we realized it was a workplace violence. These things happen. It happened in Newington, and I think that when the community gets together, we had a lot of church functions, and it comes together, and you get a little stronger, and you move forward.
Well, Tracy Suggs, how did you move forward as a mother who lost a child? What did it take for you to keep going on with your life every day after an incident like that?
What kept me going on in my life every day is the love of my child. Somebody took his life, but they can never take his love from me. And that's my strength to go on. As far as the question was asked, how do you recover from that? You don't recover. You just learn to live with it and go on, because as a mother and a person of society, you have to come to grips with it and know that there's nothing else you can do to change it, but you have to live through it for those that you have lost. So there's no such thing as a recovery.
Right.
You never recover from it.
Absolutely.
You learn to live with it.
All right, we've got a question from a member of the audience. Sir, what's your name and your question?
My name's Jeff. I think the topics that we're discussing today is important and encouraging, but I think from what I've heard today, what can we do to save lives today? I know it's hard to prevent this thing from happening, but for example, in the school, going back to school security, there's been discussion about how we can make the school safer. When an incident like this occurs in a mass shooting, there's chaos right away, and you're waiting for a response from law enforcement. Has there been any thought or legislation on making it a priority for the schools to be on the same page with how to handle this situation as it happens? Perhaps better doors on classrooms that can be locked when this happens, perhaps a panic button for the teachers to say this lockdown, so it tells everybody that we need to secure the doors.
Right, potential physical changes to the actual school structure.
These are a lot of those scenarios that he depicted are in place. The problem with classroom doors is the technology wasn't there. I think now the manufacturers are moving in that direction to move, if you have a door, the glass pane is away from the handle, so basically you can't reach around and preempt the door by reaching in and opening the door. But there are the panic buttons are a great solution because there's a more spontaneous of an alerting device. You can push the button, certain doors can close. You can have an audible. The problem is that when you're pushing that, it means the threat is imminent. Could already be in the building, and it saves lives. And the teachers we train, lockdown drills, shelter in place, and whatever. And we are taking steps daily, and I think a lot of school systems now are moving forward with such ideas as he mentioned to make the schools even safer.
Joe Markley, you've talked about culture today. You're a lawmaker, but you've made the argument, as has Steve Marins, that it's not always a legal solution or a new law, but change the culture. What I haven't heard people talk about is what is the culture in a place like Newtown, or where you represent Chester and Southington, where there's such a embrace of guns. Kids are brought up to shoot guns. Newtown is NRA country. Do you think that contributes to it? Are we scared to talk about that? Would that have more of an impact on the violence we have in both city and suburb if we talk more openly about that kind of subject?
Paul, I think my concern with the culture, I think, is deeper than the gun aspect. I don't think of Southington, where I grew up, as a place that's particularly that has a gun culture, so to speak. But what I have seen in my lifetime, and I feel like getting to the point of where I can afford to sound like an old fogey, but is a tremendous change in the way that people live their lives. And it concerns me, because the discussion of media and the impact of media, I feel that the presence of media and the presence of electronic communication between people, rather than direct contact, rather than human involvement, somehow is alienating us from one another. And from nature, too, I'd say. It's a strange thing, but in the course of my lifetime, I feel like our ability to actually experience nature, experience solitude and peace, has fallen away for young people.
Let's ask the young people about that. Emerick and Jan Michaela, do you feel like you guys are growing up looking at little screens or text messaging each other or playing these video games instead of dealing with people on a human level? Because that's what Senator Martley's saying is the root part of this.
I think that young adults are on devices and electronics a little bit too frequently, and I'm going to be in all honesty, I am as well. But in some households, it sort of consumes the children, and it overwhelms a family, and it keeps them from human interaction, and it keeps a lot of other families from recognizing what society is like and what the world can be like. And I think that eliminating electronics to a certain extent could increase human interaction, and maybe it would allow families to talk about issues like this a little bit more often. But I wouldn't say that our electronically advanced society is the sole cause of people.
And I should point out the kids aren't the only ones who are consumed by that media. I know plenty of adults as well. We have a question from an audience member we want to get to.
Hi. My question is more for the policy and the clinically minded individuals on the panel. And it's kind of a two-part question. I was wondering if you can really identify any of the changes that are actually going to be made in the mental health community. And also, is this actually going to increase funding for mental health providers, especially the community-based that you were talking about before? Because I know that this discussion has come about, but what kind of changes are actually going to happen in the mental health community? Is it going to be at the policy level? Is it the practice level?
Well, that's a good question for Susan. We were talking before, because one of the questions is whether we should force some people who we feel are not getting the mental health treatment they need to get it because they pose a danger. Is that a kind of policy change you'd like to see coming down the pike?
I've got to say, thanks for the question. I've got to say that I don't envy the policymakers at all, because it is a very difficult job. But at the same time, I've got to say that it's simple. I'm sorry that mental health and medical services are expensive. Taking care of people is an expensive endeavor. We've just had an enormous healthcare debate in our nation, and I don't know that that included the mental health aspect. I am certainly an advocate for treating mental health and substance abuse issues the same way that we would treat any other medical condition.
So you're saying it's money. That's what I'm hearing. Joe Martin, is there money?
You know, it's an expensive endeavor, and we spend a great deal of money in Connecticut. We're fortunate to have the system that we do have, but that's in comparison to other states that have nearly no mental health system.
But isn't part of the issue also that if I've got a broken leg, it's an obvious situation? There are a lot of people with untreated mental illness who you would look at and you would think this person is perfectly fine, correct?
The same way that you could look at a person and not know that they have cancer. But we're going to provide treatment for them at various levels depending on how ill they are. It's not stigmatized the way it used to be, and mental health and substance abuse issues are. I like the idea that we have specialized services for these conditions the same way that we have specialized services for cancer treatments, but it's not widely accepted, and that's an issue of education and understanding, which is why my earlier comments had to do with early identification and intervention as part of what we need to do. More to the question, though, I don't think there's one particular answer to the problems in our mental health system. We need a wide array of comprehensive mental health services for children and adults on an outpatient and an inpatient level. That, period, end of story. Do we need to force people to comply with treatment on an outpatient basis? In the states, and I'm ripping somebody off, my commissioner gave me this information. She indicated that of the research that she did, of the states that do have outpatient commitment laws on the books, it doesn't sound like any of them are actually using that legislation. They're not forcibly treating people on an outpatient basis. As a clinician, I'm not so sure how it would be operationalized and what it would do to the clinical relationship that I'm attempting to have with this individual.
Well, now you're going to be making that decision, Joe Markley. What do you think of what Susan's saying?
Well, it's very interesting, and unfortunately I'm making the decision on the fly, and I confess it. That's just the terms. That is a very appealing alternative to this outpatient commitment, and yet just what I found out in the last few days and the testimony we heard last night makes me extremely skeptical about it, and skeptical about any forced medication. We certainly had many people speak to us last night that had been medicated at different points unsuccessfully and almost torturously. And as you said, a complete range of things. Some medications help some people, different kinds of therapy for other people. One of the things we've talked about when you talk about money is screening in elementary school to set up some standard tests. But it begs the question of what do you do with the children after you've identified a problem. Not only don't we have the money to do it, but we don't even have the professionals available for the amount of treatment that might result from that. So it has to be an ongoing thing. Obviously, there's been people in the legislature dealing with these issues for many years. I think they're going to have the wind behind them moving forward, and I hope they can make progress on it.
Senator, I got to wrap you up. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Want to thank everybody on the panel, in the audience, for being a part of this. Our live audience watching at home. This has been a very lively discussion about some issues that are on the front burner in our society as I speak tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. News 8 at 5 with Darren and Sonia is next. And once again, thank you for joining us for this town hall meeting.